For more than 60 years, three names have haunted American criminal history. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin walked into their cells on Alcatraz Island one night and simply never walked out again. No bodies were ever recovered. No confirmed sighting was ever verified. No court ever closed the book with certainty. What was left behind was a raft made of raincoats, a scattering of personal belongings, and a question that refused to die. Did three men actually outsmart the most secure prison in the United States? Or did the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay swallow them whole and keep their secret forever? Now, new research is forcing investigators, historians, and armchair detectives alike to look at that night in a completely different light. This is the story of how it happened, why nobody could prove what became of them, and what modern science now suggests really took place in the dark hours of. Alcatraz Island sits a little over a mile off the coast of San Francisco, close enough to see the city lights and far enough away that the distance felt like an ocean. Before it ever became a prison, it served as a military fort, its granite walls originally meant to guard the bay rather than cage men inside it. And the federal government repurposed the island into a maximum security penitentiary meant for the inmates that every other prison in the country had given up on. This was not a place designed for rehabilitation. It was designed to end conversations, to remove hope, and to convince every man inside its walls that escape was not merely difficult but impossible. Everything about daily life on the rock reinforced that message. Inmates were counted more than a dozen times every day. The guard-to-prisoner ratio was among the tightest in the federal system. Privileges as small as speaking during a meal had to be earned through obedience. The cell house itself, completed in the early 1910s, held 4 connected blocks along with a dining hall, an infirmary, and a library, all wrapped in layers of steel bars and armed observation posts. It could hold a few hundred men at once, though it rarely operated near that number, and it became infamous for housing some of the most notorious criminals in the country, including Al Capone and George Kelly, better known by his nickname Machine Gun Kelly. The truly dangerous cases were sent to a separate section where isolation cells waited for anyone who broke the rules. There was no pretense of second chances here. It was a machine built purely for control, and for nearly 3 decades, the machine appeared to work exactly as intended. In 14 documented escape attempts before, every single one ended the same way. Men were caught, killed, or presumed drowned in the bay that surrounded the island like a natural moat. The currents were fast, the water dangerously cold, and the distance to shore, though it looked deceptively short from the yard, had already claimed the confidence of every prisoner who dared to imagine freedom. Alcatraz did not need extra walls because the bay itself did the guarding. That reputation was not folklore. It was statistics, repeated year after year, until almost nobody inside those walls believed escape was worth attempting. The institution also leaned heavily on isolation as a psychological weapon. Unlike prisons that allowed inmates some measure of communal identity, Alcatraz stripped nearly everything away. Mail was limited and censored. Radio access, when granted at all, was tightly controlled. Visits from family were rare and heavily supervised. The goal was not simply to contain dangerous men physically, but to erode any sense that the outside world still existed in a form they could return to. Over time, officials came to believe that a man who no longer believed escape was possible would stop looking for a way out, and for most of the prison's history, that belief proved correct. The handful of attempts that did occur tended to be desperate, poorly planned bursts of energy rather than sustained campaigns, and the bay finished what the guard started. By the early, however, cracks had begun to show in the institution itself, even if nobody in a position of authority wanted to admit it. Decades of exposure to salt air had quietly weakened parts of the building's infrastructure, particularly around plumbing and ventilation systems installed half a century earlier. Maintenance budgets were shrinking as the federal government debated whether the aging facility was still worth the cost of running it. The prison that had built its entire reputation on impenetrability was, in a very literal sense, slowly falling apart from the inside. It would take a small group of exceptionally patient and observant men to notice exactly how far that decay had progressed, and to understand that the same walls meant to hold them could, with enough time, be turned into a way out. Then came the summer of, and everything the island stood for was quietly, methodically challenged. Frank Lee Morris was not an ordinary inmate. He had grown up largely without a stable family, moving through foster homes and youth institutions after being orphaned young, and by his teenage years, he had already begun a long relationship with the criminal justice system. Over the following years, his record grew to include armed robbery and drug offenses. But what set him apart from most convicts was not the nature of his crimes. It was his intelligence, later measured as well above average, combined with a demonstrated talent for breaking out of custody. He had slipped away from at least one earlier institution before landing at Louisiana State Penitentiary, and after escaping from there as well, authorities decided there was only one place left to send him. He arrived at Alcatraz in January of 1960, and almost immediately, according to those who knew him, he began quietly studying the building for weaknesses. He did not have to look far to find allies. Morris had crossed paths in earlier facilities with John and Clarence Anglin, along with a fourth man named Allen West, and fate placed all four of them in neighboring cells along the same cell block. That physical closeness became the foundation of everything that followed. Late at night, when the guards assumed the prisoners were sleeping, the men could talk quietly through the gaps between their cells, trading ideas, testing plans, and slowly building what would become one of the most patient and calculated escape operations ever attempted from a maximum security prison. Morris naturally became the strategist of the group. His prior escapes had taught him that success rarely came from a single bold move. It came from research, timing, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. The team identified a critical weakness that the prison's own engineers had never fully addressed. Years of exposure to salt air had slowly corroded the concrete around the ventilation grates beneath each sink. That crumbling material, invisible to a casual glance, became the entry point for a tunnel that would take months of careful, near-silent labor to complete. John and Clarence Anglin were two of 13 children raised in a poor farming family in rural Florida. Their childhood taught them how to work hard, rely on each other, and survive with almost nothing, lessons that would matter enormously once they turned to crime and, eventually, to escape. Their path into serious trouble came through a string of bank robberies that eventually landed them at a federal penitentiary in Atlanta. It was there that prison officials grew so frustrated with their repeated attempts to break out that they transferred both brothers to Alcatraz, believing the island would finally put an end to their ambitions. Instead, Alcatraz reunited them with Frank Morris, a man they already knew and trusted from earlier stretches behind bars. With cells positioned near his and near Allen West, the brothers became essential partners in the plan taking shape around them. While Morris focused on engineering the route out, John and Clarence handled logistics, gathering materials during work assignments, quietly stealing tools, and helping construct the disguises that would keep the entire operation hidden from the guards for months. Their contribution went far beyond digging. They helped shape the raft that would eventually carry the men across the bay, and they played a central role in building the decoys that would buy the group precious hours of head start once the real escape began. Perhaps the most striking part of the plan was not the tunnel or the raft, but the sheer theatrical skill involved in covering the group's absence. Working with whatever materials they could gather, the men sculpted convincing replicas of human heads using soap, toothpaste, and toilet paper, shaping and painting them to resemble sleeping inmates. Real human hair, collected quietly from the floor of the prison barbershop, was added to complete the illusion. Placed carefully on pillows and partly covered by blankets, these decoys were never meant to survive close inspection. They only needed to fool a guard glancing briefly into a dim cell during a routine night check. And for hours, that is exactly what they did. The same attention to disguise extended to the tunnel entrances themselves. Fake vent covers made from cardboard and papier-mâché, carefully painted to match the surrounding wall, concealed the growing holes behind each sink. During the day, these covers made the cells look completely undisturbed. At night, under cover of a scheduled music period when instruments were permitted, the men worked behind them, using the noise of Morris's accordion to mask the scraping and grinding of their homemade tools against the crumbling concrete. None of this happened quickly. Digging through structurally compromised but still solid material with little more than stolen spoons, discarded blades, and a crude drill improvised from a vacuum motor took months of consistent, disciplined effort. Every session carried real risk. A single inspection that lingered too long, a guard who noticed dust in the wrong place, or a moment of bad luck could have ended the entire plan and the men's lives along with it. Yet night after night, the group kept working, slowly carving a path from their cells into an unguarded utility corridor above the block. Once inside that corridor, the escapees discovered a genuine blind spot in the prison security, an upper level that guards rarely checked because the aging structure made it feel more like storage space than an active part of the facility. There, hidden from view, the men set up a makeshift workshop where they built the final and most dangerous component of their plan, a raft large enough to carry 3 grown men across open water. Using more than 50 raincoats stolen or scavenged over time, the group stitched together a vessel roughly 6 feet wide and 14 feet long, sealing the seams with heat from the prison's steam pipes to make the material watertight. A modified concertina, an accordion-like instrument, was converted into a hand pump capable of inflating both the raft and a set of matching life vests. Wooden paddles were shaped from scrap plywood likely taken during work details. Every piece of that equipment had to be built in secret, tested silently, and hidden well enough to survive months of scrutiny without detection. The final obstacle inside the prison was reaching the roof itself. The men climbed roughly 30 feet, using exposed plumbing pipes, pried open a ventilation cover at the top, and once through, resealed the opening with a false bolt sculpted from soap, so that a casual inspection would reveal nothing out of place. It was one more small, almost absurd detail in a plan built entirely out of small, almost absurd details, and it worked. Not everyone who helped build the escape made it out that night. Alan West had been involved from the very beginning, chipping away at his own section of wall, gathering supplies, and helping shape the dummy heads and raft alongside the others. But on the critical night of, his tunnel simply was not ready. By his own later account, he had misjudged how much concrete remained or failed to clear the final section in time, and as he scrambled to widen the opening, the clock ran out. Morris and the Anglin brothers could not afford to wait. Dawn was approaching, and every additional minute increased the odds of discovery. They left without him. The next morning, when guards realized 3 cells contained nothing but painted decoys, West was still there to answer questions. He cooperated fully with investigators, describing the tunnel system, the route across the roof, and the group's stated destination of Angel Island, information that shaped the massive manhunt that followed. Some later theories suggested the others may have deliberately adjusted their plans once they realized West would not make it, worried that if he was caught and questioned, he might reveal details that could lead searchers directly to wherever they intended to go. West completed his sentence and lived the rest of his life as the only member of the group whose fate was never in question, the one witness left standing at the edge of a mystery he had helped design but never got to finish. On the night of, sometime between 10:30 and 11, Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped out through the tunnels they had spent months carving, crossed the roof, and made their way down to the island's edge. There, in near total darkness, they inflated the raft and vests they had built in secret and pushed off into water known for its brutal cold and unpredictable currents, aiming for Angel Island less than 2 miles away. What happened after that moment has never been definitively answered. The disappearance was not discovered until the following morning's roll call, giving the men several hours of head start before alarms were even raised. In the days that followed, the Coast Guard recovered scattered pieces of evidence: a paddle pulled from the water, a sealed packet containing personal items belonging to the Anglin brothers, and eventually fragments of the raft itself, along with a homemade life vest, found washed up near the Golden Gate Bridge. What was never found, despite an extensive search, was any trace of the men themselves. Officials at the time were quick to settle on an explanation. The bay, they argued, had done what it always did, pulling the exhausted swimmers under before they ever reached land. The prison's warden at the time later remarked in an interview that anyone who understood the wind and the water on that stretch of bay would know survival was almost unthinkable. That conclusion fit neatly with everything Alcatraz had represented for nearly 30 years, and it allowed the institution's reputation to remain intact even after being outmaneuvered. After 17 years, Without any confirmed evidence either way, federal investigators formally closed the case and declared all 3 men legally dead. For decades that closure held, at least officially. Unofficially, doubt never fully disappeared. Family members of the Anglin brothers spoke for years about mysterious cards arriving around the holidays, never confirmed but never entirely dismissed either. A photograph reportedly taken in Brazil in the mid-1970s showed 2 men who bore a striking resemblance to John and Clarence, though its authenticity was never conclusively proven. Then more than 50 years after the escape, a letter arrived at a California police department claiming to be from John Anglin himself. It stated plainly that all 3 men had survived that night, that Frank Morris and Clarence Anglin had since died of natural causes, and that John, now elderly and in poor health, was willing to negotiate a surrender in exchange for medical care. Investigators subjected the letter to handwriting analysis, forensic testing, and a search for usable fingerprints or genetic material. None of it produced a conclusive answer. The handwriting could not be definitively matched, and no biological evidence tied the letter to any of the 3 men with certainty. It sat, much like the case itself had for decades, in an uncomfortable space between plausible and unproven, credible enough to keep the mystery alive, but never strong enough to close it in either direction. News of the letter's existence did not reach the general public immediately. It stayed largely confidential within investigative circles for years before a local news outlet eventually broke the story. And once it did, interest in the case surged in a way it had not since the original manhunt. Documentary crews revisited the island. Podcast hosts built entire episodes around the surviving fragments of evidence. Online forums filled with amateur investigators cross-referencing tide charts, family genealogies, and grainy photographs in an attempt to do what federal agencies had not managed to do in half a century. None of that public enthusiasm produced a smoking gun, but it kept pressure on investigators to take a second look with tools that simply had not existed when the case was first closed. The renewed scrutiny also brought older, previously overlooked details back into focus. Retired guards who had worked the cell block and gave interviews, describing just how unnervingly quiet that particular night had been, with no alarms, no shouting, and no sign of struggle anywhere along the escape route. Some investigators pointed to that silence as further evidence of just how carefully the plan had been executed. If Morris and the Anglin brothers had panicked, improvised, or been caught off guard by the water, it seemed unlikely the entire operation would have unfolded without a single trace of chaos left behind for the morning shift to find. For years, the biggest obstacle standing between belief and proof was not the letter, the photographs, or the family stories. It was the water itself. The entire official case against survival rested on the assumption that nobody could cross San Francisco Bay in near-freezing conditions on a raft built from raincoats. That assumption finally faced serious scientific scrutiny when researchers applied modern oceanographic modeling to the exact conditions recorded on the night of. Using archived meteorological records, tidal charts, and current data specific to that stretch of the bay, researchers reconstructed the water conditions hour by hour through the night of the escape. What they found complicated the old certainty considerably.